Hey everyone! Whatever time it is for you right now, morning coffee in the States, late night chill in the UK, a cozy evening somewhere across Europe or Australia, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching from a busy city or a quiet small town, thanks for stopping by. Feel free, only if you want, to tap like, maybe leave a little comment telling me where you're tuning in from. I always enjoy reading them. It honestly feels like we're all sitting in one calm room together, letting history whisper its old stories. Alright, settle in, breathe a little slower. Because tonight we're drifting toward the open sea, where myths swirl around as thick as fog. And before we sail too far, let me drop something small. Something to make your thoughts lean forward just a little. There's a moment in this story, hidden somewhere out there, when one pirate crew discovered something unexpected, not gold, not jewels, not even food. Something that changed the way historians later understood these legends. But we'll come to that when the tide pulls us closer. For now, let's start with what we think we know about pirates. Popular culture, movies, old adventure books, Halloween costumes, and even video games has fed us a very tidy, almost comfortable set of pirate images. A wooden chest spilling with gold coins. A trembling prisoner forced out onto a long plank. A captain wearing a perfect hat, standing against the sunset with one boot on the railing like it's some kind of poster shot. But the real world of piracy, the one that existed from the late 1600s through the early 170s, the so-called Golden Age of Piracy. It was rougher, messier, more human, and far less theatrical than the stories we inherited. The famous treasure chest, for example. That classic locked wooden box with iron bands. It shows up in stories because it's dramatic and easy to draw. But what pirates truly cared about wasn't something you could bury under palm trees. They wanted goods that sold quickly. Cloth, sugar, spices, rum, medical supplies, even things as simple as ropes, tools, or spare sails. Gold was rare, and when they did get it, they spent it fast in poor towns on repairs, alcohol, food, or paying off contacts. Burying treasure would have been impractical. Pirates weren't long-term planners. Life expectancy was short, and the next naval patrol could end everything. They lived in the moment, for better or worse. And then there's the walk the plank idea, the dramatic punishment we all imagine. But when historians comb through actual logs, court records, and first-hand accounts, the plank almost never appears. Pirates didn't waste time making props for execution. If they wanted someone gone, the cruel truth is that they simply pushed them overboard or used a weapon. More often, they didn't kill captives at all. Scaring them was usually enough to take control of a ship. Violence was a tool of intimidation, not a constant performance. But even though the myths aren't real, they tell us something about how people wanted pirates to be remembered. Romanticized, exaggerated, turned into rebellious symbols. And that image grew little by little, far from the salty decks where men actually struggled with hunger, illness, storms, and cramped living conditions. Imagine for a moment the smell of tar and wet wood, the creaking of masts, the way the sea rocks your entire world, never letting you feel stable for more than a heartbeat. Most pirates slept wherever they could fit. Sometimes slings, sometimes rags on the deck, and only a few ships had enough room for anything close to comfort. Meals were simple, often stale, and water barrels turned sour quickly. But when you hear modern pirate stories, it feels like every day was treasure maps and duels. That contrast between what happened and what we imagine creates a quiet kind of tension. And in the middle of that tension sits a deeper truth. These men, and a few women, weren't heroes, but they weren't all monsters either. They were workers who'd been pushed to the edges of society. Sailors under abusive captains, enslaved men escaping brutality, indentured laborers who'd run out of choices. Many pirates came from backgrounds so difficult that a life of crime felt like freedom compared to the cruelty of legal trade ships. And then, somewhere out on the waves, something else grew. A strange, early form of democracy. Crews voted on many decisions. They elected captains and could replace them. They shared profits more equally than most navies and merchant ships of their time. A pirate captain wasn't a king. He held power only as long as the crew believed he was competent. The moment he failed them, they could remove him. These floating communities were chaotic, but they were also some of the most surprisingly egalitarian working groups of their era. Still, we'll come back to all of that. Because before we dig into these realities, I want you to quietly picture a ship drifting under moonlight. Somewhere not far from the Florida Straits, where currents twist like old stories. The night is calm. The water glimmers. And in the distance, there's a lantern swinging on a mast. Not from a pirate ship, but from a merchant vessel carrying something unusual, something not meant for sale, not meant for trade. Something that would pull a pirate crew into one of the strangest encounters historians later struggled to interpret. That, well, we're just beginning to creep toward it. Alright, let's drift a little deeper into the waves. Keep your shoulders loose. Let the world around you slow down just a bit. We're stepping back onto that rolling deck. Not the polished movie version, but the real one, rough and damp beneath bare feet. And as we move forward, this story keeps unfolding in the same quiet, ASMR-style rhythm. Steady, gentle, carrying you through the truth hidden beneath the myths. So, in the last part we touched on the famous misconceptions, treasure chests, planks, and the polished pirate aesthetic we've all inherited without even thinking about it. But to understand why these myths grew so strong, we need to look at how actual pirate life felt from the inside. Not the outside paintings or later fiction, the real heartbeat of those rough wooden ships. Imagine the air first. Thick, humid, and warm in the Caribbean, sharp, cold, and biting along the coasts of the North Atlantic. Rain never stayed off for long. Clothes never fully dried. Salt crusted over skin like a second layer. And every sound seemed to echo. The groan of rope, the slap of waves, the distant thud of something loose rolling across the deck as the ship tilted. Pirates didn't have uniforms. They wore whatever they could get. Stolen merchant clothes, worn-out sailor trousers, mismatched shirts, jackets patched with different fabrics. Bandanas weren't fashion statements. They kept sweat out of their eyes. The earrings many pirates wore weren't symbols of danger. They were often investments. A gold hoop could pay for a burial if a sailor died in a foreign port. These little realities strip away the movie shine and replace it with something grounded, human. Sometimes grim. But even in this roughness, pirates carved out a kind of order. Crews often wrote articles, agreements that functioned like constitutions, a set of rules everyone followed. And these articles weren't empty words. They covered everything from how loot was divided, to how injuries were compensated, to how disputes were settled. Some even banned gambling to prevent fights. Others required lanterns to be extinguished at a certain hour to avoid fires. Fines existed for reckless behavior. In a way, it was like being inside a floating workers' union. Strange, improvised, and rough, but more balanced than many governments on land at the time. The romantic image we have today, of pirates as wild rebels with no rules, comes from later storytellers who found it more exciting to erase the structure. But the structure was essential. Without it, a ship full of desperate, armed men would fall apart in days. And then there's the part most people don't think about, medical care. Pirates, surprisingly, were often better treated than lawful sailors. Many crews elected a surgeon, or at least someone with knowledge of herbs and simple procedures. When money came in, surgeons were paid more because the crew needed them alive. And if a man lost a limb, something that happened more often from accidents than battles, he might receive compensation from the shared profits. In a world where merchant captains sometimes abandoned injured sailors without pay, the pirate system looked almost compassionate by comparison. Yet even with these small comforts, life was brutal. Food ran out, water soured, rats chewed through sacks of grain. Sickness swept through cramped spaces quickly. And storms. Storms were the worst. Massive walls of water slamming into the hull, turning the world into a spinning chaos. In moments like that, myths didn't matter. There was no heroic pirate silhouette against lightning. Just men clinging to ropes, praying the mast wouldn't snap. But where did the myths come from then? Why did later generations transform rough criminals into charming outlaws? Part of it started with early writers, people like Daniel Defoe, who blended fact with entertainment to sell books. And then came theater productions in the 1800s, adding flamboyant clothing, dramatic lines, and exaggerated personalities. By the time film arrived, the transformation was complete. The messy truth had shrunk into a neat, profitable legend. Still, even within the truth, there were moments that felt strange enough to blur into myth. Like that quiet night we paused at earlier. The merchant ship drifting gently under its dim lantern, the one carrying something unusual. Let's step back into that scene now. Picture the pirate ship first. The crew half sleep-deprived, half restless. The lookout squinting across dark water. The soft glow on the horizon growing brighter as the merchant vessel drifts closer. No cannons firing, no loud shouts. Just the soft splash of oars as a boarding party approaches cautiously, expecting maybe sugar, maybe cloth, maybe dried meat. But what they found wasn't cargo meant for trade. Inside the hold there were crates, yes, simple wooden nailed shut. But when pirates cracked the first one open, it wasn't treasure. It wasn't weapons. It wasn't food or rum or spices. It was something that made them pause. Quietly. Confused. A cargo that didn't belong in a merchant hold. A cargo not recorded on the ship's manifest. A cargo the surviving crew of that merchant vessel later refused, stubbornly, to explain. Historians found references to this encounter tucked into fragments of testimonies, notes from trials, and old shipping records. Nothing complete. Nothing detailed. Just enough to raise questions. And as the pirates stood there, lantern flickering, shadows bending across the strange crates, they realized this was one of those moments where reality shifted just slightly. Where something unexpected could drag them off the simple path of plunder into something more complicated. And that is where the tide is pulling us next. Alright. Settle back into the rhythm of the waves with me. Let the sound of the water in your imagination soften the edges of everything around you. We're stepping gently into the next stretch of this long, slow-moving history. Still grounded in real facts, still told in that human, easy-to-follow style, still drifting through the truth behind pirate myths. So, that strange cargo. Picture the dim lantern light again. The way it flickers across the inside of a cramped hold. The air is warm, thick, almost stale. Pirates aren't elegant explorers. They're tired men with rough hands, bruised shoulders, clothes that smell of salt and sweat. And yet, here they are, pausing, staring at a crate that doesn't belong in the usual world of maritime trade. But before we open that a little more, we need to understand what kind of pirates we're actually sailing with. Because not all pirates were the same. Some were careful planners. Some were reckless. Some avoided violence wherever possible. Some embraced cruelty. Their background shaped how they acted in moments like this. Most Golden Age pirates started as regular sailors. Many were forced into service on navy ships or merchant ships under harsh conditions. On those vessels, punishments were severe. Whippings, beatings, starvation rations, withheld pay, and long months at sea without rest. A cruel captain could make life unbearable. So when an opportunity to mutiny or flee appeared, men took it. They slipped into piracy not because of romantic dreams, but because it offered a little more dignity and a lot more freedom. These crews operated with surprising structure. They elected captains. They voted on major decisions. They maintained codes of conduct. And when they encountered something unexpected, like a mysterious cargo, they didn't rush blindly. They discussed. They argued. They weighed risk. Now keep that in mind as we return to the strange crates in the merchant ship's hold. The first crate is cracked open with a pry bar. The nails groan. Wood splinters. One pirate, probably barefoot, steps back as dust floats up. Another man leans closer, eyes adjusting to the flickering lantern glow. Inside is not gold, not jewels, not anything that looks valuable to the usual pirate mind. It's paper. Stacks of it. Bound manuscripts. Letters sealed with unfamiliar symbols. Charts with areas deliberately scratched out. Wax tablets smeared to obscure something beneath the surface. And a few heavy metal instruments that look vaguely like surveying tools or navigational devices, but not the standard kind sailors used. This isn't treasure. This isn't trade. This isn't normal. And the pirates, uneducated in many things but extremely sharp when it comes to the unusual, know right away that they've stumbled into something politically sensitive. Many merchant ships carried secret documents or coded orders, especially in wartime. And during the early 1700s, European empires were constantly shifting alliances, fighting naval wars, and scrambling for control of sea routes. So the pirates freeze for a moment. Then the questioning begins. The merchant crew, tied on the deck above, refuses to talk. Their silence is too firm, too rehearsed. And surprisingly, they seem more afraid of what's in the hold than of the pirates themselves. But let's widen our view a little. Step away from the lantern-lit hold and back into the broader reality of piracy. Because the way they handled situations like this wasn't guided by myth. It was guided by survival. Movies show pirates eager to fight. In truth, they avoided battle whenever possible. Cannon fire damaged ships. And ships were expensive, precious, difficult to repair. A single hole below the waterline could end everything. So real pirate tactics relied on speed, intimidation, colorful flags, loud shouts, and overwhelming presence. Make the merchant ship surrender quickly. That was the goal. The famous Jolly Roger flag, with its skull and crossbones design, wasn't a fashion choice. It was psychological warfare. When that flag rose, it signaled to the target. Surrender now, and nobody gets hurt. Stubborn captains sometimes resisted, but rarely for long. And despite their violent reputation, pirates often treated captured crews better than the navies did. Many allowed non-combatants to leave unharmed. They rarely harmed passengers unless provoked. And if they found sailors who themselves were abused by their own captains, they sometimes invited them to join. These details matter, because in the case of our mysterious cargo, the pirates' reaction wasn't wild or chaotic. It was cautious, calculated, real. One man, maybe the quartermaster, who usually carried more authority than people realize, nudges the crate with his boot and mutters something about state secrets or government nonsense. Pirates wanted quick, sellable goods, not political trouble. But reality has its own currents, and sometimes they pull a crew in directions they never intended to go. The next crate is opened. Inside are more papers, some water-stained, some wrapped in oiled cloth to keep them dry. A sealed tin container. A rolled map with no markings except faint grid lines. And near the bottom, a small locked wooden box, no bigger than a human skull. Not a treasure chest, not a pirate prop, just a box. But something about the weight of it, the way it thuds when lifted, the way the merchant crew flinches when they hear the sound, suggests this isn't just another dull container. Still, the pirates don't open it. Not yet. Real pirates weren't reckless in moments like this. That's another myth we've inherited. The idea that they'd immediately smash open anything that looked valuable. But in truth, they were careful, especially with unfamiliar objects. They'd seen enough ships transporting gunpowder, unstable chemicals, or strangely sealed cargo to know that curiosity could literally blow a man apart. So instead of opening the small box immediately, they set it aside. They keep going, one crate at a time. And as they move deeper into the hold, they begin to realize something unsettling. Nothing in this cargo is meant for trade. These crates are arranged too deliberately, too protected, too secret. And then, quietly, almost as an afterthought, one pirate finds a rolled parchment tucked behind a beam. The wax seal is cracked, the edges wrinkled from humidity. He opens it slowly, smoothing it against the wall. It's a map, but not of coastlines, not of islands, not of ports. It's a map of something else, something inland. Something marked only with faint, nearly erased symbols that don't look European at all. Something someone deliberately tried to hide before the ship ever left port. And standing there in that hold, surrounded by scattered documents and quiet fear, the pirates realize they haven't just captured a merchant ship. They've intercepted a secret, one that no treasure chest myth ever prepared them for. All right. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders soften again, and imagine the ship rocking gently beneath your feet. We're still moving through this long, soft-spoken history, one wave at a time, keeping everything grounded in real facts, real events, real textures of pirate life. No myth, no movie gloss, just the quiet truth carried across centuries, and the strange encounter unfolding aboard that captured merchant vessel. So let's step back into that dim hold. Lantern light swaying, wood creaking, the smell of damp rope drifting in from above. The pirates stand over the scattered crates, papers, and that mysterious heavy little box set aside on a barrel. But before we follow their reaction, we need to understand more deeply why this scene feels so unusual in the real historical world. Because pirates rarely cared about paperwork, and governments in that era rarely risked transporting sensitive documents by ordinary merchant ships. Yet, it did happen. During the early 1700s, empires like Britain, France, and Spain often relied on civilian vessels for secret deliveries when their naval fleets were stretched thin. Wars in Europe, like the War of Spanish Succession, pulled resources away from the colonies. Merchant ships sometimes carried coded instructions for governors, maps of contested territories, or reports about indigenous alliances. These documents could influence the balance of power in the Caribbean, which made them extremely valuable, and extremely dangerous to mishandle. Now, pirates in real history occasionally stumbled onto political secrets without meaning to. And when they did, the consequences could echo far beyond a simple act of plunder. Some pirated documents accidentally exposed smuggling networks. Others revealed naval schedules. Some even influenced diplomacy when captured papers ended up in rival empires' hands. So here, in this dim, rocking hold, the pirates aren't just confused. They're aware, even if only instinctively, that this cargo has the potential to complicate their lives in ways they don't want. The quartermaster, steady and practical, gestures for the men to keep searching. He's not interested in the politics. He just wants to be sure nothing valuable is being overlooked. Cloth, tools, medicine, or even small amounts of coin hidden among papers. But as the search continues, the pattern becomes clear. More documents, more charts, more sealed envelopes with broken wax, more objects that look like measuring devices. Nothing else that would sell quickly in a pirate haven. And upstairs, under guard on the deck, the merchant crew watches the hold quietly. Too quietly. Their fear isn't focused on the pirates. It's focused downward into that ship's belly. On the cargo itself. That kind of fear is not normal. And the pirates sense it. One of the younger pirates, barefoot, shirt torn, hair tied with a scrap of cloth, crouches beside a crate filled with tablets coated in hardened wax. These are common tools for clerks, scribes, and military engineers. But these look different. The wax has been heated and smeared roughly, as if someone tried to erase information quickly before the ship was boarded. That's when another pirate, older, missing 2 fingers from an accident long ago, mutters something about government spies or secret missions. His voice is low, almost hesitant. Pirates in real history weren't afraid of many things. But getting entangled in state affairs was one of them. Because punishment for piracy was already death. But punishment for capturing classified material, even by accident, could be brutal, accelerated, and unforgiving. Now, let's shift away from the crates for a moment and breathe deeper into the world outside the ship. The broader truth of how pirates moved through the ocean's political landscape. Pirates were not isolationists. They relied on ports, legal ones like Kingston or Nassau, and illegal ones scattered through hidden inlets. And these ports were full of informants, spies, corrupt officials, and merchants trying to survive in a world of empires competing for power. Pirates walked a thin line, trading stolen goods to people who were often the same officials hunting them at sea. For instance, in Nassau, during its peak as a pirate haven, governors switched loyalty depending on who controlled the region. Deals were made quietly. Gold changed hands under tables. Pirates sometimes acted as unofficial informants. The line between outlaw and tool of the crown blurred often. That's important, because the moment a pirate crew unknowingly captured secret government documents, they were no longer just criminals at sea. They were potential messengers of sensitive information, or potential targets. So now picture the hold again. The lantern swings. A soft thump echoes as the ship shifts. The men lean over the small wooden box again, the one with the strange weight to it. Still they don't open it. Not yet. Instead, one pirate lifts a folded parchment from the corner of another crate. He squints at the ink, running a thumb lightly over the faded writing. The symbols aren't immediately recognizable. They aren't English or Spanish or French. Not Dutch either. They look older, more stylized, almost like a mixture of indigenous Caribbean markings and European cartographic shorthand. This is where we have to pause. Not for drama, but for clarity. Because in real history, European powers often misunderstood or misrepresented indigenous symbols on maps. Some charts contained hybrid notation, indigenous place-based knowledge blended with European measurements. These were not mystical. They weren't coded treasure maps. They were practical tools for navigating unfamiliar terrain, coastal shallows, rivers, or inland passages. But to a group of pirates with limited formal education, those markings could look mysterious, even threatening. And this particular set of markings, faint, half-erased, smudged by moisture, seems to mark a location inland, far from any coast, far from any common trade route. This isn't pirate fantasy. This is what actual early 18th century secret cartography looked like. The pirates stare, unsure what it means, unsure what they're supposed to do with it, unsure if keeping this map will bring profit or trouble. Above them, footsteps creak, the captain pacing slowly across the deck, thinking. Pirate captains weren't tyrants. They were elected because they were steady in uncertain moments, brave when needed, cautious when necessary. And right now, caution is heavy in the air. He knows that something about this captured ship isn't normal. But down in the hold, something else is happening. One pirate, with calloused fingers and a habit of observing quietly, gently lifts the sealed tin container from the second crate. The metal is dented from years of use at sea. When he shakes it slightly, something rattles inside. Small, delicate, metallic. Instruments, maybe. Or samples. Or messages in a form not meant to be opened by anyone except a designated official. And when he looks up, he catches the eyes of the merchant ship's first mate on the deck above, who instantly looks away, jaw tightening, fingers gripping the railing. That reaction tells the pirates more than words ever could. Whatever is in that tin, whatever is in the box, whatever is in those smeared wax tablets and obscure maps, it isn't meant for pirate hands. And the merchant crew is terrified that it's now out in the open. Real pirates didn't seek mysteries. But sometimes, mysteries sought them. And as the lantern light flickers across the scattered papers, illuminating the faint shapes of erased symbols, the pirates feel, quietly, that something has shifted. Something subtle, something they can't name yet, but something that isn't just another night of plunder. All right. Let's ease back into the slow rocking rhythm of the sea. Keep your breath soft. Let your imagination settle again onto that creaking wooden deck. We're still drifting through the real world of pirates. No fantasy, no movie flair. Just the human texture of early 18th century life at sea, and the strange, uncomfortable discovery these men have stumbled into. Lantern light flickers. Obsway. The pirate ship and the captured merchant vessel are lashed together, rising and falling with the swells like two tired creatures sharing the same breath. Down in the hold, the pirates stand among crates stuffed with documents, erased wax tablets, coded maps, surveying tools, sealed tins, and that one heavy little wooden box resting on a barrel. Before we follow their next move, breathe in that air for a moment, the thick humidity, mixed with the scent of pine tar and damp hemp rope. Life aboard any wooden ship in the 1700s, pirate or merchant, always smelled of wood softening from moisture, old fish trapped between planks, oil lamps burning low, and human bodies trying to stay dry in a world that was never dry. Real pirate history sits in those details. And so does the tension of this moment. Now let's creep toward the next layer of truth. Up on deck, the pirate captain has been pacing. His name doesn't matter. History rarely preserved the names of every captain, and many used aliases anyway. What matters is the way he walks. Slow, calculating, pausing every few steps to look toward the merchant crew tied near the mainmast. He isn't cruel by nature. Many pirate captains weren't. They relied on the loyalty of their men, and loyalty only came from shared respect. If he misreads this situation, if he mishandles this cargo, he could bring trouble not just on himself, but on every man aboard. The merchant captain tries to maintain a dignified posture, but sweat beads at his hairline. His jaw works like he's chewing a secret he's terrified to swallow. He knows what the pirates have found. Or rather, he knows part of it. And real merchants in the early 1700s feared pirates, yes, but they feared their own governments more. A merchant could be imprisoned for mishandling official documents, even if he had done nothing wrong. If a government sent him across the sea with sensitive material and he let it fall into enemy hands or pirate hands, he could be tried for treason. So the merchant captain stays silent, even now, even with the threat of death. Back below deck, the pirates continue sorting through the cargo with increasing unease. They're rough men but not ignorant. Many can read, more than people assume. Merchant ships often force sailors to sign papers, read orders, or navigate logs, and literacy among working sailors was far higher than stereotyped. A few aboard this pirate crew were once clerks or apprentices before running to sea. One of them kneels beside the papers, gently brushing dust off a set of folded documents. The handwriting is neat, deliberate, written by someone trained in administration. A seal on one corner shows the faint imprint of a crown, possibly British. But the markings on the map found earlier were not British. They resembled a mix of indigenous Taino symbols and Spanish boundary sketches. Charts like this were often made during land disputes, especially in the Caribbean interior where European maps were incomplete or inaccurate. So this merchant ship was transporting something related to territorial claims. Not treasure, not goods, not trade. Information. The pirates know, instinctively, that information of this kind is far more dangerous than even the rarest gold. Information ties back to governments. And governments do not forgive lightly. The hold creaks, and the lantern sways harder as the ship rocks. One pirate steadies it with a hand before turning toward the little wooden box. It hasn't been opened yet, but everyone keeps glancing at it. Its presence hangs in the air like a held breath. The man lifts it again, feeling the weight. Dense, compact, uneven. Not coins, not jewels. Something irregular inside. Something that shifts slightly when the box tilts. That's when the quartermaster steps closer. In real pirate crews, the quartermaster wasn't a side character. He was the balance to the captain's authority. He managed discipline, divided loot, negotiated with prisoners, and represented the interests of the crew. Sometimes he held more practical power than the captain himself. He puts a hand gently on the lid of the box and murmurs to the men around him. Not here. Not in the dark. Because real sailors respected darkness. Too many accidents happened when lanterns were the only light. A wrong move, one spark, and a whole ship could burn. So even curiosity bowed to caution. They carry the small box up to the deck, where night air moves cleaner and the moonlight gives shape to things without fire. The men gather around. The merchant crew watches, tense and silent, trying not to show their fear. Their captain looks away only when the box is placed on a coil of rope. And here, before the pirates even touch the latch, history pulls us sideways for a moment. Because this scene, the fear, the secrecy, the tension, it echoes real events that occurred throughout the Caribbean during wars between European powers. Some merchant ships were indeed used to transport coded instructions, boundary surveys, diplomatic drafts, and indigenous artifact samples collected by colonial administrators or missionaries. These items weren't mystical, they were political tools. Tools meant to extend influence over land and people. So now imagine the box, illuminated by moonlight. The quartermaster kneels. The men lean in. The latch is stiff, corroded by salt. He works it slowly, carefully, until it clicks. He lifts the lid. Inside are objects wrapped in cloth. Not many, just a few. He unfolds the first cloth, rough linen stained by age and moisture. Inside it is a chunk of carved stone, not shaped like a figure, not a statue, not an idol, just a fragment, flat on one side, etched on the other with markings that match the strange symbols from the map. The pirates exchange glances. The merchant captain looks away altogether, as if the sight pains him. The quartermaster unwraps the second cloth. Inside this one is a metal tool, bronze, worn smooth at the handle. It looks like a measuring instrument, indigenous in design, but with adaptations added by a European hand. And then the third wrap is opened. A small, fragile bundle. Cloth peels back. Inside is a set of folded papers, older than the rest, edges cracked, ink faded to brown. These papers aren't government documents. They're older, far older. The symbols match the carved stone fragment. They match the map. They match something the pirates cannot name. And yet, historically, items like this did exist. Early explorers, missionaries, and colonial officials collected indigenous manuscripts, carvings, and tools, sometimes to study, sometimes to control local populations, sometimes simply out of curiosity. These objects were often mishandled, misinterpreted, or lost to time. But here, in the moonlight, they sit in the hands of men who have no idea what they've just opened. The deck is quiet. Only the waves speak. The pirate captain, watching from a few steps away, finally moves closer. He kneels beside the quartermaster and picks up the carved stone gently, turning it over in his calloused palm. Then, without raising his voice, he asks the merchant captain a single question. "What were you carrying this for?" The merchant captain doesn't answer. He closes his eyes, because the answer is not simple. And whatever mission he was part of was never meant to cross paths with pirates at all. So let's just settle back into that dim lantern-lit world again. The creak of wood, the slap of waves, that slow rhythm that feels almost like someone gently rocking you to sleep. And as we drift deeper into the reality behind the myths, we land right in the middle of something people often misunderstand about pirates. How they actually lived day to day, how they survived between raids, and how far those realities were from the glossy legends we see in movies. Because if you imagine a pirate ship as this loud, chaotic place with constant shouting, guitars, parrots flying around, and gold coins spilling onto the deck, well, the truth looked more like a floating workshop mixed with a cramped, floating village. Everything was about routine, practicality, and honestly, most days were mind-numbingly boring. You woke up to the smell of damp wood, sweat, maybe salted fish if you were lucky. You navigated by the wind. You patched sails, you scrubbed decks, you cleaned cannons, you rationed food and fresh water carefully. And in that quiet monotony, you start to understand why some of the more dramatic myths were invented later. The real day-to-day didn't look cinematic. It looked tired. And if you stood on deck early in the morning, when the mist was still lying low and soft over the waves, you wouldn't see treasure chests or flashy weapons. You'd see men sewing torn shirts, scraping barnacles off the hull, fixing ropes, some telling crude jokes, some staring off at nothing because sea life had a way of making your thoughts slow and heavy. Pirates didn't walk around brandishing swords for fun. Steel was expensive, And you kept your blade wrapped, stored, and clean so it didn't rust. Even pistols weren't waved around dramatically. Gunpowder was too precious to waste. But the biggest surprise for most people is this. Pirates didn't spend their lives chasing treasure. They spent it chasing supplies. Water, food, medicine. That was real treasure. If you boarded a merchant ship and found barrels of flour, dried beef, or citrus fruit, that was victory. That was survival. The gold, silver, or precious cargo stories. They happened, sure, but rarely. And when they did, the loot was almost always shared or spent quickly. Because you couldn't store it long, too risky. And there was no point burying it in the sand unless you were temporarily hiding it during a pursuit. Nobody was planning some big X marks the spot moment for future generations. If anything, what pirates hoarded, if you can even call it hoarding, were the small comforts that made life at sea bearable. Maybe a good knife, a bit of tobacco, a deck of cards, a spare pair of boots. You'd find these tucked into hammocks, crammed in wooden sea chests no bigger than a laundry basket. Not treasure chests. Just simple personal boxes barely big enough for essentials. And when you think of that cramped, sweaty world, imagine how myths start to drift in like fog. Maybe a young sailor years later tries to tell his children about his time at sea and smooths out the dull parts. Maybe a storyteller hears a tale secondhand and exaggerates the danger. Maybe an author adds a dramatic punishment like walking the plank, something rare enough that it barely occurred. And when it did, it wasn't even the standard method of dealing with captives. Truth was, throwing someone overboard was unnecessary trouble. Pirates had no reason to add ceremony to cruelty. They used whatever method was fastest. But fantasies grow legs. Stories travel faster than ships. And the world back home, with no smell of bilge water, no taste of moldy bread, no aching shoulders from rowing, was more than happy to imagine something thrilling instead of real. And while we're already floating in this soft, slow space, it's worth picturing how pirates actually interacted with each other. Because despite their reputation, they followed rules. Strict ones. You couldn't just start fights on deck. You could be punished. You couldn't steal from your fellow crew. That was a serious offense. You couldn't gamble away essential equipment. If two men had a dispute they couldn't settle, they were sometimes given pistols or swords and taken to shore to resolve it out of sight so the crew wouldn't be dragged into it. Codes kept order. And that sense of order was the true backbone of a pirate crew. Not chaos like movies show. Picture the soft light of dawn again, washing over a ship. Men stretching, cracking joints, yawning. Someone checking the horizon for sails. Someone else stitching a button onto his shirt with rough, clumsy hands. Small moments, quiet ones. And slowly you start to feel the rhythm of what pirate life truly was. Patience. Long stretches of waiting. Being at the mercy of winds, storms, shortages. Hoping for luck. Hoping for land. Hoping the next ship you spot isn't stronger than yours. And in that long, steady hush, even the myths begin to sound like they were created out of boredom. Stories traded while everyone sat on the deck, passing time between distant shorelines. But as we continue drifting further into this deep history, something more interesting begins to take shape. Something tied to how pirate crews were built, how democratically they operated, and why that structure shattered so many modern assumptions about their world. So let's slide quietly back into that slow, rolling world, the deck creaking under bare feet, the low hum of morning voices carrying across the water, and ease into one of the most surprising truths about pirates: their sense of order. Not the kind of order we imagine from Navy ships with strict ranks and iron discipline, but a rough, practical order shaped entirely by survival and fairness. Because once you understand the way these crews were structured, so many myths begin to fall apart. Most people picture a pirate captain barking orders, ruling like a tyrant, shouting at trembling sailors. But in reality, a pirate captain had limited power. Very limited. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even a boss. He was more like a skilled specialist the crew voted into the role because he could fight well or navigate storms. And the moment they felt he wasn't useful anymore, they could vote him out. No drama. No secret mutiny. Just a simple crew decision. Imagine that. In a world obsessed with kingdoms, crowns, and absolute authority, pirate ships were quietly running on democracy. Every major decision, where to sail, which ship to attack, how to divide plunder, was put to a vote. Even discipline. If a man stole from another, the crew decided his punishment. If someone disobeyed during a battle, again, it was the crew who handled it. Power belonged to everyone, not one person. And that kind of freedom, well, it attracted a very specific sort of person. Not the glamorous rogues you see in films, tossing witty one-liners and flashing perfect jewelry, but runaway sailors escaping cruel merchant ships. Enslaved people who found refuge on pirate vessels. Escaped indentured servants. Even political rebels. Many were broken, scarred, hungry, and exhausted. And a pirate ship offered something simple but powerful. Equality. A vote. A share of the profits. A chance to live outside the crushing hierarchy of the world. When you picture them this way, sitting in a circle on the deck, talking, arguing, deciding their next move, it becomes clear how far myth has drifted from truth. These weren't men chasing treasure chests buried under palm trees. They were chasing a life where no captain could whip them, starve them, or abandon them. A pirate crew didn't bury gold because they usually divided it immediately. Pay was given out according to risk. The surgeon earned more. The quartermaster earned a little less. Ordinary sailors got a fair share. No one was left out. And the quartermaster, he was the real balancing force. More powerful than the captain in everyday life. He handled supplies, discipline, distribution. If the captain was the sword arm of the ship, the quartermaster was the spine. And that two-part leadership kept crews stable. But beyond structure and voting and shares, there was something softer too. Something you don't hear about often. The small acts of care pirates gave each other. If a man lost a leg, the crew compensated him with extra money, because they knew he couldn't work the same way anymore. If someone fell ill, they shared the limited medicine they had. If a man died, his belongings were auctioned among the crew, and the money went to his closest friend or chosen partner on board. You feel the warmth in these gestures. The humanity. And maybe that's why, on those long, quiet nights when the sea was black as ink and the only sound was the slow whisper of wind, men would sit in little groups, telling stories. Some of those stories were real. Encounters with storms, fights with navies. But others drifted off into imagination. Stories of ghost ships, sea monsters, buried treasure. And because the nights were long and boredom ran deep, each storyteller added just a little extra. A little more danger, a little more sparkle. And somewhere in those stories, the legend of walking the plank was born. A thrilling punishment that never had widespread historical roots. In truth, pirates had no need for theatrics. If someone needed to be punished, they did it quickly. If they wanted someone gone, they marooned them, abandoning them on a tiny island with minimal supplies. A harsh, slow punishment, not a dramatic leap into the sea. Still myths spread. Sailors repeated them in taverns, travelers carried them across oceans, and writers polished them until they gleamed like gold coins in a lantern light. But beneath those myths was always the quieter, heavier truth. Life at sea was fragile. And danger didn't come from treasure hunts or plank-walking spectacles. Came from disease, storms, hunger, conflicts with navies. The slow gnawing loneliness of endless horizon. And now, as this lantern glow flickers inside your imagination, we start drifting toward one of the most misunderstood parts of pirate life. Something less about routine, and more about the strange, unpredictable ways pirate ships dealt with fear, superstition, and the raw uncertainty of the sea. Let's settle back into that gentle rhythm again. The soft sway of timbers, the distant hush of waves brushing against the hull, and drift into an aspect of pirate life that shaped their world more quietly than any battle or any stolen prize. Superstition. Because when you're surrounded by nothing but open water, when storms appear out of nowhere and illness slips through a ship like smoke, you begin to understand why so many sailors, pirates included, leaned on beliefs that blended fear, hope, and tradition. Picture a pirate ship at twilight, the sky turning a bruised purple, the last streaks of gold sinking into the sea. Men move carefully, almost reverently, not because of orders, but because of old rules. Rules whispered from one ship to another long before movies and novels turned pirates into playful tricksters. One of those rules: never whistle on a ship. Whistling was believed to challenge the wind, to call storms, to tempt the sea into trouble. So even a simple tune hummed between the teeth could turn heads and stir discomfort. Another rule: never bring bananas on board when preparing for a long voyage. They believed bananas brought bad luck, spoiling cargo, attracting pests, even hiding venomous spiders inside bunches. And because so many accidents had happened on banana-laden merchant ships, the superstition stuck. But the strongest of these beliefs were tied to the dead. Because pirates knew the sea could take a life in an instant. And when someone died on board, that thin boundary between the world of the living and the quiet unknown felt even thinner. The crew often held a small ritual. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, but sincere. Sometimes a prayer. Sometimes a moment of silence. And always a sense of unity, because out there, death wasn't some distant fear. It was a shadow that brushed past every hammock at night. Some sailors believed spirits followed the ship after death. Some believed a drowned man could guide storms or calm the water. Others felt that ghosts clung to objects, especially a dead man's belongings, which is partly why auctions were held so quickly. Redistributing items prevented them from becoming symbols of grief or bad luck. But even with all that superstition, pirates weren't mindlessly fearful. They were practical. They used beliefs the way modern people use habits, to create a sense of control in a world ruled by chaos. And that same practicality shaped the tools of the trade. Real pirates didn't carry curved, flashy swords like the ones you see in movies. Their main weapon was the cutlass, a short, sturdy blade perfect for cramped ship decks. Easy to swing, hard to break. They used pistols too, but those old flintlocks were unreliable and slow. You got one shot, maybe two. Then you switched to a blade, a boarding axe, or even your hands. Movies make pirate battles look beautifully choreographed with elegant sword fights and dramatic leaps. But the truth was much closer, heavier, more chaotic. When two ships clashed, smoke filled the air, powder burned the throat, shouts mixed with screams, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. It wasn't a dance, it was survival. And even then, pirates didn't seek battle unless they believed the ship they were targeting would surrender quickly. The goal wasn't to fight. It was to scare their target into giving up without resistance. That's why flags mattered so much. The famous black flag, what we now call the Jolly Roger, wasn't chosen for style. It was psychological warfare. A black flag meant, surrender now and we won't harm you. A red flag meant, no mercy if you resist. Simple, direct, terrifying. And yet another myth crumbles when you understand that pirates weren't trying to sink ships. A sunken ship meant lost goods, lost supplies, lost chances. They wanted ships intact, cargo dry, and captives cooperative. But here's something deeper. Something most people never imagine. Many pirate crews had musicians on board. Fiddlers, drummers, flute players. Music wasn't some romantic entertainment. It was a lifeline. On long voyages, a tune could soothe nerves, pass the time, even build rhythm for rowing or hauling lines. Imagine a soft melody drifting over the water during a windless night. Men humming along while staring at the stars. A rare moment of calm in a life built on risk. And those moments, quiet, ordinary, human, are the ones missing from the glossy myths. It wasn't always danger. It wasn't always swagger. Sometimes it was just a group of exhausted men sitting on crates, eating stale biscuits, tapping their boots to a tune played by someone who barely knew 3 notes. But those notes felt like home. And as we drift even deeper into their world, we begin approaching one of the most revealing truths about pirates. Something that explains how they survived, how they formed bonds, and why the romantic image of treasure-hunting rebels misses the far more complex, far more human reality waiting beneath the surface. So just let yourself sink back into that soft, steady rhythm again. The ocean lifting and lowering the ship like some enormous sleepy breath. and we'll ease deeper into the human side of pirate life. Because the next layer isn't about weapons or myths or even superstition. It's about relationships. And the quiet, invisible threads that kept pirate crews functioning in a world where danger was constant and trust meant survival. We often imagine pirates as loners drifting from port to port, but in truth, the sea forced them into a kind of closeness that's hard to picture today. Imagine sharing a tiny wooden world with dozens of other men. Day after day, night after night. You slept shoulder to shoulder in hammocks that swayed with the ship. You ate from the same pot. You shared stories, fears, hopes, and sometimes secrets. And as rough as pirate reputations were, that closeness formed a kind of family. Not perfect, not gentle, but deeply reliant. When you woke up in the middle of a storm with water flooding the deck, you needed to trust that the man beside you would haul the ropes, hold the line, and keep the mast from snapping. When you boarded a ship in battle, you needed to believe someone would watch your back, reload your pistol, or drag you out of danger if you fell. And when sickness swept through the crew, as it often did, it was the other pirates who dragged buckets of water to the sick, cleaned their wounds, and tried to cool their fevers. So even though pirate myths paint them as wild rebels, the reality shows people who depended on one another more tightly than many soldiers on land. And this closeness didn't come from rules alone. It came from shared suffering. Most pirates had been abused on merchant ships. Some had been whipped, some starved, some forced to work through storms with barely any rest. So when they became pirates, that shared pain made them fiercely protective of one another. They knew exactly what they'd escaped from. Now imagine the quartermaster, often the heart of the ship, walking the deck with soft steps during the night, checking rations, making sure the sick had water, dividing food fairly so no one went hungry while others feasted. That fairness, more than treasure, was what turned ordinary sailors into loyal crew. And because pirate life was so fragile, bonds sometimes went even deeper. Two men might choose each other as sea brothers. An arrangement where they pooled their belongings, protected each other, and inherited each other's share if one died. Some historians see these bonds as emotional partnerships, others as practical alliances. But whatever shape they took, they reveal a truth. Pirate life wasn't just about plunder. It was about connection in a world that gave very little kindness. And while these human connections grew in the cramped belly of the ship, something else was always simmering in the background. Tension. Because even on a democratic ship, disagreements happened. Strong personalities clashed. Long voyages wore patience thin. Small arguments could explode. And that's where pirate codes mattered most. They acted like a pressure valve, guidelines that kept people from tearing each other apart. No unnecessary fighting, no stealing, no harming a fellow crewman without cause. Offenders were confronted openly, and the crew decided punishments together. Democracy again, raw and imperfect, but effective enough to keep a wooden world steady in rough seas. But that closeness, that structure, that rough equality, it all lived in constant tension with the dangers outside the ship. Because sometimes the biggest threat wasn't hunger, or storms, or naval ships. Sometimes it was silence. Those long stretches of empty ocean when nothing happened. No land, no ships, no wind, just heat, just boredom, just the same horizon every day. And in that stillness, imagination grew loud. It was during those long, quiet stretches that men told their tallest tales. Maybe one had heard of a Spanish galleon overflowing with silver. Maybe another swore he knew an island where pirates hid their riches under a particular tree. Maybe someone described a ghost ship gliding across fog. And each night, as the waves slapped gently against the hull, those stories swelled, stretched, twisted, until they became the myths we know today. The treasure chests, the cursed islands, the phantom ships, the buried loot waiting for someone brave enough to find it. Not real events, just the human mind trying to make meaning out of monotony. And if you were standing there on deck, listening to those voices fade into the darkness, you might feel that same mix of curiosity and unease. That delicate edge where myth and reality blur, creating something strangely beautiful. And as we drift farther, we begin sliding toward one of the most misunderstood parts of pirate history. Something tied deeply to fear, strategy, and the strange art of intimidation that shaped the pirate image long before Hollywood ever touched it. So let's ease ourselves gently back into that drifting world again. The ship rocking under a slow-moving sky, sails breathing softly, men murmuring as they prepare for another long day at sea, and settle into one of the most misunderstood parts of pirate life, the art of intimidation. Because long before movies gave pirates their swagger, pirates themselves crafted a reputation that worked like a silent weapon. And it wasn't about theatrics. It wasn't about flamboyant outfits or dramatic speeches. It was about strategy. Picture a ship gliding across the horizon, the morning light catching its sails. A merchant crew spots it, squints into the distance, and their stomachs drop, because they recognize the black flag flying from its mast. Not the skull and crossbones symbol we see plastered on costumes today, but sometimes a skeleton holding an hourglass, sometimes a bleeding heart, sometimes a horned skull, each version whispering the same message: time is almost up. Surrender now. The flag wasn't decoration. It was the core of pirate psychology, a way to avoid bloodshed by making fear do the work for them. Because pirates didn't want fights. A damaged ship meant lost cargo. Injured men meant slower travel. And repairing battle wounds, on bodies or wood, took time and supplies they couldn't waste. So intimidation was the cleaner, smarter choice. But their reputation didn't build itself. It was carefully shaped through calculated cruelty. But only in specific moments. If pirates captured a ship that resisted too fiercely, they sometimes punished the captain or officers harshly, knowing word would spread. And once fear started traveling through the docks, taverns, and ports, pirates didn't need to do much more. Their image did the heavy lifting. Imagine that reputation drifting from mouth to mouth like a dark fog. Those men don't give second chances. They fly a red flag, you know what that means. They leave no survivors if you fight back. Stories stretched further than truth ever reached. And pirates let them grow. Because the bigger the myth, the less they had to risk. And that fear carried into every encounter. When a pirate ship approached a merchant vessel, they didn't shout dramatic lines like movies show. No witty insults. No playful banter. Instead, it was simple. A warning shot. A raised black flag. A moment of silence while everyone waited. And most ships surrendered without a single cannonball fired. But intimidation didn't stop with flags. Pirates used appearance as a weapon too. Not glamorous costumes, but practical ones that looked strange to outsiders. Bandanas kept sweat out of their eyes. Scarves protected necks from the sun. Loose, mismatched clothing was comfortable for climbing rigging. Pierced ears were believed to prevent seasickness. And because life at sea meant constant injury, many pirates had scars, missing fingers, or weather-beaten faces that gave them a wild, intimidating look without trying. Add in smoke from the cannons, the roar of boarding calls, the sound of boots thudding across decks, and you can imagine how terrifying that moment of capture felt to a helpless crew. But once on board, pirates weren't always as vicious as legend claims. They didn't torture for entertainment. They didn't tie men to masts and whip them for fun. They wanted efficiency. They asked about the cargo. They inspected the hold. They searched for hidden valuables. Sometimes they took hostages to negotiate. And if the captured crew cooperated, many were released unharmed, because pirates weren't trying to start wars. They were trying to stay alive. But here's where one of the biggest myths dissolves. Pirates rarely kept prisoners long-term. Feeding extra mouths wasted resources. They released most captives on shore soon after. And sometimes, if a sailor seemed skilled or frustrated with his current life, pirates offered him a place among them. This is how crews grew. Not from forced recruitment, but from choice. Because the pirate world, harsh as it was, still looked better than the brutality of merchant ships, where captains beat crew without consequence and sailors lived in near-starvation conditions. So intimidation wasn't just about scaring enemies. It was about drawing new members too. A man watching pirates move with confidence, sharing loot fairly, voting on decisions. He might look at his own miserable ship and think, why not take the risk? And beneath all the myths, that more than treasure or adventure, was what kept pirate crews alive. But the deeper we go into their methods, the more another layer reveals itself. Something tied to how pirates navigated, how they read the sea, how they relied on instinct far more than romance or legend. Because a pirate ship wasn't drifting aimlessly toward treasure maps and palm-fringed islands. They followed shipping routes, seasons, winds, patterns. They knew where merchant fleets traveled. They knew when Spanish silver galleons crossed certain waters. They knew which ports were weakly defended. They knew which coasts offered fresh water, fruit, safe anchor. And all this knowledge came from experience, not from glowing X's on parchment. And now, drifting even deeper into this slow, rhythmic world, we begin reaching the heart of one of the greatest pirate misconceptions of all, the idea of endless excitement and glamorous adventure. Because the truth was far heavier, far quieter, and far more human than myth ever dared to show. Let's return slowly to that soft sway of the ship, the gentle rocking of the hull against waves, the faint creak of rigging, and the smell of salt in the air. Close your eyes if you like, or just let your imagination drift across the planks, because now we're moving into another quiet human truth about pirates that rarely makes it into the stories we hear. Their survival depended on observation, patience, and an intimate understanding of the sea. Pirates weren't aimless thrill-seekers. They weren't sailing from one island to another just for fun. Every move they made was a calculation, rooted in knowledge gathered from years at sea. They observed wind patterns, currents, and tides. They knew where storms were likely to gather. They understood the behavior of birds, the smell of fish, and the color of water that indicated reefs or shallow sandbanks. Every detail mattered, because a single mistake could sink the ship or the crew. And much of this knowledge was passed down orally. There were no formal pirate academies, no textbooks. Young sailors learned from older ones, often by trial and error. Mistakes were punished, not with spectacle, but with consequence. A missed reef, a capsized dinghy, a loss of food or water. All of these were harsh lessons that shaped the crew's understanding of the ocean. And speaking of food and water, this was the real treasure. The myths loved to show chest after chest of gold, but on a pirate ship, the most coveted items were fresh water, salted meat, hard biscuits, and fruit that could stave off scurvy. Pirates often raided ships not for silver, but for these essentials. A barrel of flour or a cask of wine could save lives more effectively than a pile of coins ever could. Imagine the daily routine on deck. Men climbing the rigging at first light to adjust sails. Others scraping barnacles from the hull. A small group in the galley trying to make a stew from whatever was left after the last raid. The heat is relentless. The smell of salt and sweat mingles. And yet, in the midst of it all, there's a rhythm, almost hypnotic. A cadence that turns repetition into survival. Even rest was carefully structured. Pirates rotated watches. So some men slept while others steered or scanned the horizon for other ships. Sleep was light, interrupted by the sound of waves or the snap of a sail. Naps were short. Exhaustion was a constant companion. And here is one of the most surprising parts. Pirates also depended heavily on alliances. Yes, they were criminals to the law, but pirates often coordinated with other crews, forming temporary agreements to share intelligence about heavily guarded merchant ships, or even to team up for raids too large for a single ship. They traded not just goods, but knowledge. Currents, seasonal winds, fleet movements. These alliances were practical, fragile, and fleeting, but critical. Yet in the quiet stretches between raids, boredom reigned. This is where the myths take flight, filling in the monotony with imagined heroics. In truth, much of pirate life was slow, repetitive, and sometimes painfully mundane. They played cards, told stories, polished weapons, mended sails, and watched the horizon. And in those hours, imagination ran wild, giving rise to tales that would grow into legends. But even in this slow, measured life, the element of risk was constant. Every storm, every encounter with a naval ship, Every poorly navigated reef could end the journey. And yet pirates embraced it. Not for glory, but because staying on a merchant vessel or naval ship often meant certain punishment, death or captivity. Freedom at sea was dangerous, yes, but it was freedom. And so, the life they lived was a careful balance between risk, routine, and human connection. Every decision, where to sail, what ship to chase, which ports to visit, was measured, debated, and executed with precision. Myth has made it appear as reckless abandon, but the reality was calculated and deliberate. As the lanterns flicker across imagined decks, and the quiet waves slap against the hull, it becomes clear. Pirate life wasn't about swashbuckling romance. It was about survival, camaraderie, and cleverness in the face of endless danger. And it's in this balance of monotony, strategy, and the ever-present threat of death that the real story of pirates comes alive. Far richer and stranger than any myth. Let's drift again into that slow, swaying world of the ship, where the waves rise and fall like soft breaths, and the creak of wood beneath your feet is a lullaby and a warning at the same time. Now, as we move deeper, it's time to focus on another layer of pirate life that rarely reaches the movies. How pirates handled law, order, and justice aboard their ships. Because contrary to the wild images of chaos, pirate ships were surprisingly structured. Every crew had rules, a code, often called the Articles of Agreement. These codes varied from ship to ship, but they shared common principles: fairness, accountability, and clear consequences. Every crew member signed them before joining. And once signed, they weren't optional. The captain led during battles and navigation decisions, yes, but for nearly everything else, the quartermaster held power. He enforced the code, mediated disputes, and ensured that division of plunder was fair. Imagine a council of sailors, seated on barrels or the deck itself, arguing over stolen goods or unfair treatment. Everyone had a voice. Everyone had a vote. No one, not even the captain, could overrule them arbitrarily. Punishments existed, but they were practical. Stealing from a crewmate. You might be fined from your share of the plunder. Disobeying orders in battle. You could lose privileges, food rations, or even face marooning. And marooning, a punishment we often hear about, was brutal, yes, but it was rare and highly calculated. Pirates didn't use theatrics like walking the plank for entertainment. They removed threats efficiently, but without unnecessary spectacle. Life at sea demanded fairness because survival depended on cooperation. One bad decision could cost everyone their lives. And that is why pirate codes were not suggestions, they were lifelines. They maintained morale, trust, and ultimately loyalty. A crew that operated fairly could survive storms, battles, and scarcity far better than a crew that ruled through fear alone. Now let's picture the practicalities. Food was scarce. Fresh water even more so. Pirates rationed both meticulously. Each man knew his share. The surgeon, if one existed, might get extra for treating injuries. The captain and quartermaster, also slightly higher, because they were responsible for keeping the ship functioning. The rest of the crew, equal shares regardless of age, skill, or origin. That equality surprised many sailors from strict hierarchies ashore. It also attracted recruits. And discipline didn't just exist for human interactions. Ships were dangerous places, full of ropes, pulleys, sails, and rigging. A single mistake could mean serious injury or death. Fires could break out from powder stores. Cannons misfired. Storms shredded sails. So rules were applied to everything. How to store gunpowder, how to climb rigging safely, even how to share sleeping space. A well-ordered pirate ship was, in many ways, a highly efficient machine disguised as a floating outlaw haven. Yet, despite this order, pirates were flexible. Rules bent slightly in times of crisis. Creativity mattered. The captain and quartermaster could adapt codes to suit a dangerous situation. A storm, a pursuing naval ship, or a sudden lack of provisions. Flexibility, combined with equality, kept crews loyal and functional. And here's a subtle truth. Pirates also handled outsiders cleverly. Captives weren't killed unnecessarily. Merchant crews were interrogated for intelligence, but usually released. Pirates weren't bloodthirsty for its own sake. They were strategic. Violence was a tool, not a pastime. And that reality is far removed from romanticized depictions of endless cruelty or mindless horror. By understanding law and order aboard pirate ships, we start seeing them not just as rogues or criminals, but as a microcosm of society at sea. A society built on cooperation, accountability, and shared risk. That's why some historians argue that pirate ships, in their rough democracy, were more advanced in social organization than many of the nations they challenged. And as the lanterns flicker over decks and the ship rocks gently beneath the night sky, we glimpse the strange, quiet paradox of pirate life. Danger and boredom, cruelty and fairness, fear and democracy, all existing in the same floating world. It's messy, human, and endlessly fascinating. And as we drift further into their daily existence, the next layer emerges. Navigation, strategy, and the clever ways pirates maximized advantage at sea without relying on fanciful treasure maps or supernatural luck. Let's ease back into that gentle rocking world, the ship rising and falling with the slow pulse of the ocean, the scent of salt thick in the air, the faint creak of rigging like a lullaby and warning rolled into one. Now we move into a topic that's often misrepresented in stories and films: pirate navigation and strategy. Because pirates were not aimless wanderers chasing X marks on the sand. They were careful planners, students of the wind, and masters of reading the sea. A pirate ship moving across the Caribbean or Atlantic wasn't drifting randomly. Captains and navigators studied trade routes meticulously. They knew where merchant fleets traveled, which ports were lightly defended, and when naval convoys were expected. They timed raids based on wind patterns, tides, and seasonal storms. And every movement was calculated with an eye toward survival, not drama. Maps were tools, not treasure guides. Charts often contained information about shoals, reefs, hidden coves, and currents. European explorers and local sailors had gathered this data over decades. Pirates used it, sometimes stealing maps from captured vessels, sometimes keeping mental notes. Knowledge of the coastlines, river mouths, and inlets could mean the difference between escape and capture. Now think about the human aspect. A young sailor, barely 18, learns under an older navigator to read the horizon for changes in watercolor that indicate shallow reefs. He memorizes the flight patterns of seabirds that signal nearby land. He notices subtle differences in the smell of the wind that hint at an approaching storm. This knowledge isn't glamorous. It's painstaking. It's survival. But it's what allowed pirates to navigate far more effectively than someone relying purely on luck or legends. And strategy wasn't just about movement, it was about psychology. Pirates understood that fear could be as valuable as gunpowder. Approaching a merchant vessel, a single black flag could convince a captain to surrender without a shot fired. Boarding tactics were carefully planned. Men assigned to secure the sails, others to disarm the crew, a few ready to watch the prisoners. Every role was deliberate. Pirates also timed attacks for when targets were vulnerable. Many attacks occurred early in the morning or late in the evening when merchant crews were tired. They approached with speed, often sailing with the wind, so escape was difficult, and they avoided unnecessary risk. A ship that was too well defended wasn't attacked, because pirates calculated the costs. Injured crew, damaged vessel, lost plunder. Strategy always trumped heroics. And yet, even with all the planning, the unexpected happened constantly. Storms arose without warning. Currents shifted. Supplies spoiled. Men fell ill. The ocean demanded attention, respect, and adaptability. And pirates who survived long voyages were the ones who could combine their knowledge with flexibility, cleverness, and intuition. The romantic image of pirates hunting buried treasure is particularly misleading. While gold and silver sometimes changed hands, most treasure was spent quickly, stolen for practical reasons, or used to bribe officials and secure safe harbor. Treasure maps with elaborate codes or X marks the spot were largely the invention of storytellers and novelists. In reality, pirates relied on observation, experience, and intelligence gathered from captured ships and coastal communities. Even at night, pirates were careful. Watches rotated. Lookouts scanned the horizon. Lanterns were dimmed to avoid detection. Silence could mean survival. Every detail mattered. The way sails were trimmed, the direction of anchor drops, the placement of men on deck. And despite what films show, chaos rarely reigned during an actual raid. Each crew member had a specific job and knew it well. And there's one more subtle truth. Pirates understood the economic and political landscape. They knew which nations were at war, which colonies were poorly defended, and how to exploit tension between rival powers. Capturing a ship sometimes meant taking advantage of political divisions, leveraging bribes, or using prisoners as bargaining tools. The romantic notion of pirates as pure rebels ignores the deeply strategic intelligence that guided their actions. So, as the waves rocked the ship and lanterns cast dancing shadows across the deck, imagine the quiet tension and thought behind every move. Each action, from raising a flag to choosing a target to reading the horizon, was deliberate. Nothing was left to chance. Survival depended on it. And as we drift further, the next layer will explore another overlooked truth. The human cost of pirate life, disease, injury, and the fragile balance between camaraderie and constant danger. Let's settle back into that rocking, creaking world, where the smell of salt water hangs heavy, the faint groan of timber echoes with each swell, and the air feels thick with anticipation and quiet danger. Now we move into one of the harshest realities of pirate life. Disease, injury, and the human cost of living at sea. Life aboard a pirate ship was unforgiving. Open decks and cramped quarters meant that illness spread quickly. Dysentery, scurvy, typhus, and infections from minor wounds could devastate a crew. Fresh water and fruit were precious because they literally meant survival. A ship without citrus could see scurvy take men in just a few weeks. Pirates didn't always have access to medical care, and surgeons were rare. Those who did exist often relied on basic remedies: herbs, alcohol for sterilization, and crude surgery. Imagine a young sailor with a swollen leg from a rope burn. Pain courses through him, every step painful, every movement exhausting. The surgeon works quickly with limited tools, wrapping the wound, preventing infection as best he can. Nearby men help haul water and clean bandages, because survival depended on teamwork. If the injured man recovered, he returned to his share of duties and plunder. If not, his share might go to a trusted sea brother or next of kin among the crew. Hygiene was another struggle. Salt water wasn't enough to keep skin clean. Men slept in hammocks that rarely dried completely. Clothing was reused, patched, and often carried the combined smell of sweat, tar, and smoke. Fleas and lice were constant companions. Pirates adapted as best they could, but illness was ever present. And then there were the injuries of combat. A cutlass strike, a misfired pistol, or a fall from the rigging could leave men disabled. Pirates had no hospitals. Every injury had to be treated on deck or below, with whatever materials were at hand. Recovery was slow, painful, and uncertain. Survival often depended on luck as much as skill. Despite these hardships, pirates built resilience. Strong bonds and democratic codes helped. Men who survived illness or injury relied on the crew's support. Compensation existed for those who could no longer perform their duties. And those bonds, though forged in harsh conditions, often outlasted the pirate career itself. Food scarcity added another layer of danger. Stale biscuits, salted meat, and spoiled water were common. Pirates raided ships not only for treasure but for sustenance. Every voyage was a gamble. One mistake could mean starvation. And in that scarcity, fair distribution mattered more than legend suggests. The pirate code dictated that everyone received an equal share, no matter their rank, and fairness became a tool for morale and survival. Psychological strain was just as real. Weeks or months at sea meant endless horizon, monotony, and tension. Crew members feared storms, naval ships, and betrayal. Fear and boredom fueled the stories that became myths. Ghost tales, sea monsters, and treasure legends were ways to entertain, frighten, or bond in a world that offered little else. And yet, Despite exhaustion, disease, and danger, pirates survived through skill, camaraderie, and adaptability. Their democracy, their practical knowledge, their strategic approach to raids, and their careful attention to logistics and supplies allowed them to thrive in conditions that would have broken most sailors. Now, as you imagine that dimly lit deck, men tending wounds, mending sails, rationing food, and whispering stories into the wind, you begin to sense the delicate balance pirates lived within, between survival and death, monotony and chaos, fear and trust. And as we drift further into this world, the next chapter will explore pirate relationships with the lands they visited, the communities they interacted with, and how those connections shaped their strategies, survival, and ultimately, the legends that endure. Let's drift again into that gentle rocking rhythm, the faint slap of waves against the hull, the smell of tar and salt, and the soft murmur of voices carrying across the deck. Now we move into one of the quieter, often overlooked truths of pirate life: their relationships with the lands and communities they encountered. These interactions shape survival, strategy, and sometimes even the myths that persist today. Pirates didn't exist in isolation. They relied on coasts, islands, and ports for provisions, information, and temporary refuge. Some islands were barren, offering only rocks and palms. Others had settlements where locals traded food, fresh water, or other necessities. Pirates often relied on informal alliances with these communities, exchanging goods, labor, or protection. Knowledge from locals about tides, hidden coves, or merchant routes was invaluable. And yet, relationships were complex. Some communities feared pirates and avoided contact. Others welcomed them, either out of desperation, greed, or shared opposition to colonial powers. In these moments, pirates navigated a delicate balance. Intimidation, diplomacy, and sometimes bribery ensured safe passage and continued supply. The romantic image of pirates freely roaming islands, hoarding treasure, or pillaging endlessly is far from this nuanced reality. Pirate crews also relied heavily on reconnaissance. Scouts might row quietly to shore to observe a settlement, noting defenses, provisions, and the presence of officials or soldiers. This intelligence determined whether a raid, or even a brief stop, was worth the risk. Planning, patience, and subtlety were far more critical than flamboyant heroics. And while ashore, pirates didn't behave like lawless savages at all times. Many were careful, respectful even of local communities. They traded fairly, avoided unnecessary destruction, and sometimes integrated temporarily into the local economy. Stealing was risky. Local retaliation, colonial authorities, or neighboring pirates could quickly turn the tide. Now, imagine a pirate landing on a small, sheltered cove. Men unload barrels of fresh water, salted meat, and fruit. They negotiate quietly with locals, offering coins or goods in exchange. A few men explore the coastline, memorizing landmarks, noting where reefs or hidden inlets could provide shelter in storms. These are the small, unglamorous acts of survival that underpin every myth you've ever heard. Even interactions with captured crews were strategic. Pirates needed intelligence about shipping routes, seasonal trade winds, and fleet schedules. Questions were asked with care, threats were measured, and prisoners were released once they'd served their purpose. Killing indiscriminately or creating enemies unnecessarily was bad strategy. History shows that pragmatism guided pirates more than sadistic impulses. And yet, despite all this strategy, survival still required courage. Life on the edge, navigating uncharted waters, battling disease, rationing food, and confronting storms required skill and adaptability at every turn. Pirates were human, vulnerable, inventive, and resilient. Their world was messy, dangerous, and unpredictable. Even the infamous myths, buried treasure, walking the plank, cursed gold, often originated from these real interactions. Stories stretched and shifted as sailors told them in taverns, port towns, and settlements. Every exaggeration was a lesson, a warning, or a form of entertainment in a world that offered few distractions. And as you picture this, the rocking ship, the quiet conversations on deck, the soft glow of lanterns, and the endless horizon stretching into night, you begin to feel the true rhythm of pirate life. equal parts human, practical, dangerous, and surprisingly organized. The stories we know are only fragments of a far richer, quieter, and more compelling reality. Let's drift once more into the gentle sway of the ship, the faint whisper of waves against the hull, and the creak of timbers underfoot. Now we move into another overlooked truth: the social structure and hierarchy aboard pirate ships. Far from the chaotic anarchy popular culture imagines, pirate crews operated under a sophisticated, practical system designed for fairness, efficiency, and survival. Every pirate ship had roles and responsibilities. The captain led during battles or complex navigational maneuvers, chosen for skill and experience. The quartermaster, however, often held more power during day-to-day operations. He maintained order, divided plunder, enforced the ship's code, and represented the crew's collective interest. This balance ensured that no single person could dominate the ship arbitrarily. Below them, every crew member had duties: climbing rigging, maintaining sails, cleaning the deck, standing watch, handling cannons, or managing supplies. These duties rotated, so every man shared the burden and the danger. Even young or inexperienced sailors were given responsibilities suited to their abilities, learning practical skills over time. Pirates were also surprisingly democratic. Major decisions, targets to attack, division of loot, or punishments, were often voted on by the entire crew. A captain could be replaced if the majority lost confidence in his leadership. Discipline was enforced according to agreed-upon rules. Theft, desertion, or endangering the crew were punished, but the consequences were proportionate and transparent. This system of shared responsibility and accountability created a sense of fairness rare in the 17th and 18th centuries. Merchant or naval sailors were often treated brutally by their superiors, yet pirate ships offered equity. Every man, regardless of rank, age, or nationality, had a voice and a stake in survival. And pirates rewarded skill and courage. A surgeon, navigator, or skilled gunner often received extra pay, while common sailors received equal shares otherwise. These incentives reinforced competence and loyalty. Crew members understood that cooperation and contribution directly impacted their own survival and prosperity. Life aboard ship was still dangerous and monotonous. Storms, disease, poor food, and exhaustion were constants. Pirates spent long stretches mending sails, scrubbing decks, or standing lookout. Even entertainment was functional. Music, storytelling, and games passed the time and built morale, but they were never frivolous distractions. And yet, amidst all this structure, personality clashes and tension arose. Crew members came from diverse backgrounds: escaped slaves, runaway servants, foreign sailors, or disgruntled merchants. Conflicts were inevitable, but the democratic system allowed them to be addressed openly, often preventing violence from spiraling out of control. And here's a subtle truth: pirates respected competence and bravery more than wealth or heritage. A skilled sailor from a poor background could rise in influence, while a rich but inept man could find himself marginalized or voted off. This meritocratic element was revolutionary for its time, and partly explains why pirate crews could function effectively under extreme stress. Even supply management followed careful order. Fresh water, food, and gunpowder were rationed. Stealing from fellow sailors wasn't just illegal, it jeopardized everyone. Pirates developed ingenious methods to ensure fairness, such as counting shares or using trusted officers to oversee distribution. This sense of fairness was critical to morale and survival. And so, beneath the myths of treasure chests and swashbuckling bravado, pirate life was organized, practical, and surprisingly equitable. Danger and monotony coexisted, but human ingenuity, cooperation, and fairness kept these floating societies alive. As the lanterns flicker on deck and the wind whispers through the rigging, we begin moving toward the next hidden truth: the psychological and emotional life of pirates, the ways they coped with fear, loss, and isolation while facing the endless horizon of the open sea. Let's drift once again into the gentle rocking of the ship, the creak of timbers beneath our imagined feet, the soft slap of waves against the hull, and the faint scent of salt and tar. Now we turn to one of the most overlooked aspects of pirate life: their psychological and emotional world, the way they dealt with fear, isolation, and the constant presence of death. Life at sea was harsh. Endless horizons, storms that came without warning, disease, scarcity of food and water, all created a persistent undercurrent of stress. A pirate had to be alert at all times, mentally and physically. Sleep was light and often interrupted. Men faced exhaustion daily. Yet despite these pressures, they developed strategies to maintain morale and mental resilience. Storytelling was one method. On calm nights, pirates would gather on deck, sharing tales of previous voyages, clever maneuvers, narrow escapes, or ghost stories. These tales served multiple purposes: passing time, entertaining, bonding the crew, and sometimes exaggerating events to warn others or enhance reputation. Each story was a mix of memory and embellishment, a small way to cope with the monotony and danger of life at sea. Music also played a role. Fiddlers, drummers, and flute players provided rhythm during work, helped pass time, and created a sense of community. Even a simple tune could lift spirits, distract from the harsh conditions, and remind men of life on land. Music, laughter, and shared rituals became emotional lifelines in a world dominated by fear and uncertainty. Isolation from the wider world was another challenge. Pirates spent weeks or months away from home, family, and familiar faces. Letters and messages were rare, and news of events back on land was often months old. Crews relied on one another not only for survival but for emotional support. Bonds between men were often deep and unbreakable, forged in shared hardship. Some historians describe sea brothers, a form of chosen family, where men pooled resources, looked after one another, and even inherited shares of plunder if one died. Fear was constant. A storm could sink the ship in hours. A poorly loaded cannon could misfire. A disease outbreak could wipe out half the crew. And yet, pirates learned to manage this fear practically. Training, drills, and careful preparation helped mitigate dangers. Rituals, superstitions, and small customs provided psychological control over uncontrollable elements. Whistling was avoided, bananas weren't brought aboard, and certain omens were respected, not out of blind belief, but as tools to maintain focus and discipline. Loss was an inevitable part of life. Men died from disease, injury, or combat. When a crew member passed, pirates held quiet rituals, often auctioning their belongings to benefit chosen comrades, keeping a sense of fairness and respect even in death. Emotional bonds were maintained despite constant danger, reminding the crew that each individual mattered. And in quieter moments, pirates were capable of reflection. They thought about home, their choices, the ocean's vastness. Loneliness, fatigue, and uncertainty shaped their personalities. It was a harsh world that demanded adaptability, resilience, and reliance on community. This emotional and psychological layer explains much about pirate behavior, their camaraderie, and the decisions they made at sea. It also shows why the romanticized, glamorous image of pirates misses the depth of their human experience. Survival was mental as much as physical, and fear, hope, and resilience defined their daily lives more than treasure ever did. And as the ship rocks gently, lanterns casting flickering shadows, and the quiet of night settles over the deck, we prepare to explore another often misunderstood facet: pirate ships' interactions with each other, their alliances, rivalries, and the strategic intelligence that governed their movement across the oceans. Let's settle back into that slow, rolling rhythm of the sea, the soft slap of waves against the hull, and the faint murmur of voices across the deck. Now we dive into a crucial yet often misunderstood aspect of pirate life: the relationships between pirate crews themselves, the alliances, rivalries, and intelligence networks that shaped their survival and success. Pirates rarely acted entirely alone. While films often show a lone ship chasing treasure, the reality was far more strategic. Crews observed, communicated, and sometimes collaborated with each other. Temporary alliances were formed to take on a larger target, share intelligence, or avoid mutual destruction by naval forces. These were practical, short-term agreements, always fragile, always negotiated. Intelligence gathering was essential. Pirates relied on information about merchant fleets, naval patrols, and seasonal trade routes. Captured sailors were questioned discreetly. Prisoners might be released after providing information. Scouts and lookouts noted the positions of other ships, shifting currents, and coastal defenses. Every interaction, whether a tense encounter with a rival pirate or a casual exchange in a port, was an opportunity to gather knowledge. Rivalries also existed, often intense. Pirates competed for the same targets, territory, and ports. Conflicts could arise over loot, reputation, or breaches of the code. Yet violence between crews was costly and avoided when possible. Pirate strategy emphasized negotiation, intimidation, and calculation over unnecessary risk. Survival required careful diplomacy as much as skill with weapons. Pirate alliances also served as a social network. Crews shared tips about safe harbors, secret coves, and hidden sources of food or water. They warned each other about naval patrols or military expeditions. In many ways, this was an informal, decentralized intelligence system. Pirates supporting each other without formal governance, bound by practicality rather than law. And even within alliances, trust was measured. Pirates understood human nature. Betrayal was always possible, so interactions were cautious. Agreements were often sealed by shared risk rather than written contracts. A crew might sail together for a raid, but part ways immediately afterward. Flexibility and vigilance were key. This network of collaboration and rivalry also influenced myths. Tales of massive pirate fleets, simultaneous attacks, and coordinated raids often grew from real-world alliances, exaggerated in storytelling. Similarly, myths of cursed treasure or ghostly warnings sometimes originated from messages and warnings passed between crews, misunderstood or embellished over time. And yet, despite these strategic alliances and rivalries, pirates never lost sight of their primary goal: survival. Every interaction, whether negotiation, intimidation, or brief cooperation, was designed to keep the ship and crew alive, maintain resources, and secure advantage. Violence was a tool, not a default. Planning and observation were paramount. Imagine a pirate ship sighting another on the horizon. Crew members tense, weapons ready, but the captain assesses the situation. Could this ship be an ally, an enemy, or a neutral vessel? How might weather conditions affect a chase? Which crew has the advantage? Decisions are made calmly, quickly, and deliberately. These moments, far from the romantic chaos depicted in fiction, showcase the intelligence and strategy underlying pirate operations. And as the lanterns flicker across the deck, the wind whispers through rigging, and the horizon stretches endlessly, it becomes clear. Pirates were not merely chaotic outlaws. They were shrewd strategists, observers of human behavior, and masters of survival in an unpredictable, dangerous world. And as we drift further into this world, the next layer will explore the practical realities of treasure and plunder, the myths versus the economic and material realities of pirate life at sea. Let's drift once more into that rocking, creaking world of the ship, the gentle rise and fall of the waves, the smell of salt and tar in the air, and the faint murmur of the crew settling into their tasks. Now we turn our attention to one of the most famous myths of pirate lore: treasure. The buried chests, the glinting gold, and the fantastical plunder that Hollywood loves to show. But in reality, the economics of pirate life were far more practical and mundane. Pirates rarely buried treasure. The idea that they hoarded gold in secret locations, leaving maps with elaborate X's, is largely a creation of fiction. Pirates needed immediate resources: food, water, ammunition, and sometimes bribes to local officials or safe harbor. Storing wealth long-term was impractical. A lost ship, theft, or capture could wipe out their gains. Loot was divided according to the pirate code, often fairly and openly. Each crew member received a share based on rank, skill, or injury status. A captain might receive slightly more, a surgeon more for valuable medical expertise, and ordinary sailors equal shares otherwise. This equitable system reinforced loyalty and maintained morale. Gold or valuables were usually spent quickly in port, traded for provisions, or used to pay off debts or fines. The types of plunder were varied. Silver coins and gold were desirable but rare. More often, pirates took supplies. Barrels of flour, salted meat, wine, timber, and sometimes luxury goods like spices or textiles that could be sold in port. These items were practical, essential for survival, and easier to transport than chests of gold buried on islands. Buried treasure stories often stemmed from exaggeration, misunderstanding, or the few rare instances where pirates did hide valuables. But for most, treasure was a means to an end, not a long-term obsession. A captain's wealth wasn't measured in chests of gold under a palm tree. It was measured in food, ammunition, and safe passage for the crew. And the romanticized, walking the plank. Another exaggeration. Historical records show almost no evidence of pirates forcing captives overboard as entertainment. Punishments existed, yes, but they were practical. Marooning on a remote island, temporary imprisonment, or fines. The dramatic images of captives being forced into the sea for sport belong to novels and stage plays, not real pirate behavior. Pirates did rely on fear, intimidation, and reputation to control captured crews. A black flag flying from the mast could convince a merchant ship to surrender immediately, often without a fight. A reputation for swift and decisive action did more than violence. It ensured compliance and minimized risk. But these tactics were strategic, not theatrical. And while gold and jewels appear prominently in myths, pirates' real priorities were survival, crew cohesion, and efficiency. A lost ship meant ruined plans. Injured or sick crew meant slower voyages. Supplies, intelligence, and timing mattered far more than buried chests. Yet, the exaggeration of treasure and drama served a purpose. Tales of gold and curses entertained, warned, and built reputations, feeding the larger-than-life image that persists today. Even the few legendary hoards that exist, like Captain Kidd's rumored buried treasure, were exceptional rather than typical. Most pirate wealth was transient, circulating rapidly within ports and among crews. Treasure, in reality, was a practical tool, not an eternal obsession. And as you imagine the decks, the careful division of plunder, the silent calculations behind each raid, and the crew's focus on survival over glory, the myths of chest-filled islands and dramatic spectacles begin to fade. What remains is the human, pragmatic core of pirate life: strategy, resourcefulness, and adaptation to an unforgiving world. And as the night settles over the deck, with lanterns flickering and the ship rocking gently, we begin to approach another layer. The daily life and leisure of pirates, the small routines and moments that shaped morale and kept them human amidst danger. Let's drift gently into the soft rocking of the ship again, the creak of wood beneath your feet, the faint scent of salt and tar, and the quiet murmur of sailors settling into evening routines. Now we move into the subtler, often overlooked aspects of pirate life. Daily routines, leisure, and the small human activities that kept spirits afloat amidst danger. Life aboard ship was far from constant action. Much of each day was filled with repetitive, practical tasks. Men repaired sails, scrubbed decks, tended to rigging, cleaned weapons, and maintained the ship's structure. These chores were physically demanding, but they also created a rhythm, a sense of order, and a shared responsibility that kept the crew functioning. Meals, though simple, were important social moments. Pirates shared rations: salted meat, hard biscuits, occasional fruit, and whatever fresh water could be obtained. While meals were often repetitive, they provided an opportunity to converse, exchange stories, and reinforce bonds. Eating together strengthened the sense of community and fairness central to survival. Leisure was rare, but it existed. When the sea was calm, pirates played games, sang songs, or shared stories. Music helped pass the time during monotonous stretches and lifted spirits. Singing shanties while working the sails synchronized effort and created camaraderie. Storytelling was more than entertainment. It was a tool for passing knowledge, teaching lessons, and maintaining a shared sense of identity. Pirates also engaged in small competitions: climbing rigging fastest, target practice with firearms or cutlasses, or racing rowboats to shore. These activities were practical training disguised as entertainment. They built skill, reflexes, and confidence, essential for survival during raids or storms. Personal grooming and minor self-care were practiced when possible, though hygiene was limited. Pirates bathed in seawater, tended wounds, and mended clothing. Even small acts of cleanliness contributed to health, morale, and a sense of dignity amidst difficult conditions. And pirates valued mental engagement. Reading, writing letters when possible, or memorizing maps and routes kept minds active. Knowledge was power at sea, and even leisure often had a strategic element. Stories and games frequently conveyed lessons about navigation, combat, or the behavior of other crews. Conflict within the crew was inevitable, but daily routines and shared activities helped mitigate it. Structured responsibilities, fair division of plunder, and democratic decision-making allowed disagreements to be resolved without destabilizing the ship. Trust and predictability were crucial in a world where even a small error could be fatal. At night, watches rotated to keep the ship safe. Some men slept lightly, listening to the wind and the waves. Others kept lookout, quietly scanning the horizon for ships, hazards, or signs of approaching storms. Even sleep was functional, a small act of survival wrapped in routine. Despite the danger, monotony, and harsh conditions, these daily patterns created stability. Pirates were human. They needed rhythm, camaraderie, and small joys. Songs, stories, games, and shared meals were as essential as weapons and ammunition. They maintained morale, reinforced bonds, and allowed the crew to function as a cohesive unit. And as the lanterns flicker across the deck, waves lap gently against the hull, and the faint sounds of the night carry across the ocean, we approach another layer. The superstition, beliefs, and rituals that shaped pirate culture, fear, and decision-making. Let's drift gently again into the sway of the ship, the soft creak of timber beneath your feet, the faint salt scent in the air, and the quiet murmurs of a crew adjusting to the night. Now we enter one of the most fascinating and often misunderstood aspects of pirate life. Superstition, beliefs, and rituals that shaped their culture, decision-making, and even fear itself. Pirates were deeply superstitious. Life at sea was unpredictable and dangerous, and rituals provided a sense of control over forces beyond human understanding. Omens, signs, and customs were not mere theatrics. They were practical tools to maintain morale and focus. Ignoring superstitions was often seen as inviting misfortune. One common belief involved the wind and the weather. Pirates closely watched clouds, the color of the horizon, bird patterns, and sea color to predict storms. But beyond practical observation, these signs were often interpreted as spiritual warnings. A sudden change in wind or an unusual bird sighting could be seen as a message from the divine or the spirits of the sea. Respecting these signs helped pirates remain cautious, disciplined, and aware. Burial rituals, while not as romanticized as myths suggest, were also significant. Death was frequent. When a crew member died, pirates sometimes conducted simple ceremonies, marking the body, ensuring personal belongings were distributed according to the code, or performing a quiet burial at sea. These acts honored the dead and reinforced the crew's shared humanity, keeping morale intact. Colors and objects carried symbolic meaning. Red flags often signaled no mercy. Black flags could invoke fear or caution. Certain charms, trinkets, or markings were believed to bring luck or protection. These superstitions reinforced psychological control, giving pirates a sense of agency in an unpredictable world. Curses, omens, and ghost stories were common among crews. While some tales of haunted ships or cursed treasure are exaggerations, they reflected the collective anxieties of sailors. Sharing such stories served as entertainment, warning, and social bonding. They reinforced caution, vigilance, and respect for the dangers of the sea. Pirates also adhered to rituals before raids. Crew members prepared weapons, inspected supplies, and sometimes performed brief ceremonies or chants to focus attention. These acts may seem theatrical today, but they were functional, reducing anxiety, enhancing readiness, and ensuring everyone understood their role. Even seemingly irrational customs had practical roots. Avoiding certain foods, not whistling on deck, or following specific routines often minimized risk, maintained order, and strengthened shared understanding among the crew. Superstition was intertwined with survival strategy, providing structure in an otherwise chaotic environment. And here's a subtle truth. Superstition created cohesion. A shared belief in signs, rituals, and omens unified crews. It gave everyone a common language for interpreting danger, reinforced discipline, and helped maintain mental resilience. In a world dominated by risk, this psychological framework was as vital as skill with sails or cutlasses. As lanterns cast flickering shadows across the deck and the ocean hums gently beneath, imagine pirates moving with quiet caution, watching the horizon, observing signs, whispering warnings, and performing small rituals. Their lives balanced between human skill and respect for forces beyond their control, a delicate harmony of knowledge, experience, and belief. And as we drift further, the next layer will explore the evolution of the pirate image in popular imagination, how myths merged with reality, and why the romantic pirate persists despite historical truths. Let's drift again into the gentle sway of the ship, the soft creak of wood beneath our feet, the smell of salt water thick in the air, and the faint murmurs of the crew carrying across the deck. Now we approach a layer that bridges history and legend, how the pirate image evolved in popular imagination, and why myths, buried treasure, walking the plank, and flamboyant swashbuckling endured despite historical realities. Stories of pirates spread quickly in taverns, ports, and coastal towns. Sailors returning from voyages exaggerated events to entertain listeners or enhance their own reputations. Tales of daring raids, immense treasure, and ruthless violence captured the imagination, even when the truth was often far more mundane. A stolen barrel of flour might become a chest of gold. A routine boarding turned into a dramatic sword fight. Novels, plays, and later newspapers amplified these stories. Works like A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, 1724, introduced the tropes we recognize today. Black flags, buried treasure, and colorful personalities. Writers sensationalized events for readers eager for adventure. Blending fact with fiction, pirates became characters larger than life, often divorced from the practical realities of survival, discipline, and strategy. Walking the plank, for example, is largely fictional, while executions did occur. Historical records show that forcing captives overboard for sport was almost non-existent. Yet, the image persisted because it was dramatic, simple to visualize, and reinforced the idea of pirates as ruthless, theatrical figures. Treasure chests are another enduring myth. Pirates did capture valuables, but most plunder was practical. Food, wine, weapons, and trade goods. The few instances of buried treasure were exceptions, later amplified by storytellers seeking intrigue and suspense. Maps, coded messages, and buried hoards became narrative tools rather than reflections of everyday reality. Pirate clothing and appearance were also exaggerated. Bandanas, oversized hats, and eye patches were practical choices or minor personal quirks, but stories transformed them into symbols of romance, rebellion, and danger. Jewelry, tattoos, and missing limbs were real but selectively emphasized to enhance the narrative. And yet, these myths served a purpose. They captured imagination, reinforced reputations, and spread fear without requiring constant violence. A single story of a brutal pirate crew could deter merchant ships from resistance, reducing the need for actual combat. Reputation became a weapon, amplified through tales, art, and song. The romantic image of pirates also owes much to the idea of freedom. Pirates operated outside national law, chose their own leaders, and lived by codes of fairness unusual for the time. These aspects appealed to writers, artists, and audiences yearning for adventure and autonomy, even if daily pirate life involved discipline, danger, and monotony. And as we imagine the decks, lanterns flickering, sails creaking, and crew members working and resting, we see how myth intertwined with reality. Pirates were both human and larger than life, practical and dramatic, feared and fascinating. The stories we inherit are fragments, shaped by survival, exaggeration, and cultural fascination. As the ship rocks gently, waves lapping softly, and the horizon stretches endlessly, we prepare to explore the next layer. The decline of the pirate era, how naval power, changing economics, and internal pressures led to the end of the Golden Age, and the lessons we can draw from this unique slice of maritime history. Let's drift again into the soft, rhythmic rocking of the ship, the gentle creak of timbers, and the faint smell of salt and tar lingering in the night air. Now we turn our attention to the decline of the pirate era, the forces that gradually ended the so-called Golden Age of Piracy, and reshaped the maritime world forever. Pirates faced increasing pressure from powerful navies. European nations, England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, invested heavily in patrolling trade routes and hunting pirate ships. Ships once able to outrun or outgun pursuers found themselves facing well-armed fleets, faster vessels, and coordinated tactics designed specifically to suppress piracy. Survival became harder, and the risks multiplied. Economic changes also played a role. Merchant shipping became more organized and heavily protected. Convoys, armed escorts, and naval patrols reduced opportunities for raids. Trade routes shifted, and colonies tightened their control over ports. Pirates could no longer rely on easy access to supplies, information, or safe harbors. The environment that once allowed them to thrive gradually closed. Internal pressures contributed too. Pirate crews were diverse, often consisting of sailors from many nations, backgrounds, and social standings. While this diversity fostered innovation and egalitarian structures, it could also create tension. Disputes over plunder, leadership, or strategy occasionally erupted, undermining cohesion. As naval threats increased, unity became essential, but harder to maintain under mounting stress. Captures and executions by naval forces accelerated the decline. Many notorious pirates, men whose names had become legends, were hunted, tried, and publicly executed. These high-profile punishments served as warnings, reducing recruitment and discouraging young sailors from joining pirate crews. Fear of capture replaced the allure of freedom, and the balance between risk and reward shifted dramatically. Even those who survived often faced practical difficulties. Ships were lost to storms, disease, and wear. Supplies were harder to secure. Port authorities became stricter, limiting access to provisions, repairs, or trade. Pirate life, once defined by calculated risk and adaptability, became increasingly unsustainable. Yet, despite these pressures, pirates did not vanish immediately. Some adapted by changing tactics, focusing on smaller raids, or relocating to more remote regions. Others accepted pardons offered by governments eager to reduce piracy without continuous military engagement. Over time, the Golden Age faded, replaced by coastal smuggling, privateering, and legitimate trade. And here's a subtle truth. The decline of piracy was not sudden. It was gradual, shaped by strategy, law enforcement, and changing economics. The human qualities that had allowed pirates to survive, skill, observation, adaptability, and cooperation, were not enough to counter overwhelming naval power and structural changes in global trade. Survival became a rare, exceptional outcome. As lanterns flicker over quiet decks, waves lap gently, and the wind whispers through rigging, imagine the last remnants of pirate crews making careful calculations, preparing for storms, evading patrols, and weighing survival against ambition. The world they knew was disappearing, replaced by order, regulation, and the slow march of empires. And as we move to the final layer, the last batch will reflect on the enduring fascination with pirates, the lessons of their lives, and a gentle, calming conclusion that invites reflection on this complex human history. Let's drift once again into the slow, hypnotic rhythm of the ship, the gentle sway beneath your feet, the faint creak of rigging, and the soft scent of salt and tar mingling with the evening air. Now, as we approach the final chapter of pirate life before we conclude, we explore the cultural and historical legacy that pirates left behind, and how fragments of their reality continue to capture our imagination. Pirates influenced maritime law and the structure of naval power. Their challenges forced nations to invest in better ships, patrols, and navigation techniques. Some of the democratic practices aboard pirate ships, Even temporary leadership elections, codes of conduct, and equitable distribution of loot were surprising innovations for the time, illustrating a form of social experiment at sea. Historians often point out that pirate ships, in their practical fairness, contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchies and harsh punishments common in merchant and naval fleets. Culturally, pirates inspired songs, tales, and art. The exaggerated images we see in books, plays, and later films are rooted in the human need for story and drama. Myths amplified traits that were already present: bravery, cunning, audacity. Yet behind the spectacle lies a human story of endurance, adaptation, and ingenuity. Every heroic raid, every clever escape, and every narrow survival contributed to a legacy far richer than gold chests or plank-walking fantasies. Pirates also shaped commerce indirectly. By forcing merchant fleets to adapt, they accelerated the development of convoy systems, navigation charts, and safer trade routes. Their presence highlighted the vulnerabilities of empires, showing how small, agile, and resourceful crews could exploit gaps in power. In this way, pirates were catalysts for change, their practical impact extending far beyond individual acts of plunder. And on a human level, the stories of pirates endure because they resonate with fundamental themes: risk and reward, freedom and survival, loyalty and betrayal. These themes are timeless and universal. Even when myths exaggerate reality, the underlying truths, resilience, ingenuity, and cooperation in the face of danger, continue to capture our attention. Daily life, strategy, alliances, superstition, and the psychological resilience of pirates all reveal a society at sea that was complex, pragmatic, and human. The image of pirates as reckless adventurers obscures this nuance, but history preserves it for those willing to look beyond the myths. In their routines, decisions, and shared culture, pirates reveal a fascinating balance of danger and human ingenuity, freedom and responsibility, monotony and excitement. Even now, centuries later, the fascination persists. We study them not because of buried treasure, dramatic planks, or flamboyant hats, but because of what they reveal about human nature under extreme conditions: creativity, fairness, courage, and adaptability. Pirates were flawed, often ruthless, yet capable of remarkable organization and ingenuity in a world defined by unpredictability. As lanterns flicker across imagined decks, and the ship rocks slowly beneath an endless horizon, you can almost sense the echoes of those lives. The conversations, the songs, the meticulous division of provisions, the quiet tension of lookout duties, and the small rituals that maintained order and morale. Now, let's drift slowly into the final moments of our journey. The gentle sway of the ship beneath your feet, the soft creak of timber, the distant murmur of waves, and the faint scent of salt and tar mingling with the evening air. This is the last layer of our story, the reflection on the enduring legacy of pirates, and a quiet closing to help settle your mind. Even as the Golden Age faded, the lessons of pirate life remained. They were masters of adaptation, teamwork, and strategy. Their lives remind us that survival depends not on luck alone, but on observation, skill, and the careful balance between risk and preparation. They were both human and extraordinary, navigating a world of constant danger with ingenuity, courage, and camaraderie. Myths, buried treasure, walking the plank, curses, flamboyant garb, persisted because humans crave stories. But behind these legends lies a deeper, quieter truth. Pirates lived by codes of fairness, relied on intelligence, and faced psychological and physical challenges far more complex than the tales suggest. Every decision, every lookout, every rationed meal mattered. Life at sea was a continuous exercise in resilience and cooperation. Even the harsh realities, disease, injury, loss, and isolation, revealed human endurance. Pirates bonded through shared struggle, forming communities built on trust, skill, and a fragile equality rare in their time. These were real stories of survival, not fantasy. The romantic image of pirates obscures the discipline, ingenuity, and humanity that defined them. And now, as we let the story settle, imagine the ship rocking gently under the stars. Feel the soft pulse of the waves, the faint wind brushing your face, the quiet hum of life continuing aboard. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath in. And exhale slowly. Picture lanterns flickering softly on deck, shadows dancing on the rigging, and the endless horizon stretching into calm night. Let your mind rest in that quiet rhythm, feeling the human courage, ingenuity, and resilience that carried pirates through danger and monotony alike. Imagine the stories lingering in the air, whispers of adventure and survival, and the lessons they left behind. Practical, human, enduring. And as you breathe deeply one last time, carry with you a sense of calm, reflection, and curiosity, letting the waves of history and imagination settle gently within. The pirate world, complex and fascinating, remains not just a legend, but a reminder of humanity's capacity for resilience, cleverness, and connection, even in the harshest of conditions.